Welcome to this webinar called Notes from the Field, Studying the Nexus of Religion, Gender, and Populism from a Global Perspective. I'm Molly Loss, and I direct the Religion in the Public Sphere program at the Social Science Research Council. And this webinar stems out of a workshop that we had sponsored on comparative perspectives in gender, religion, and populism. And so we're very excited to present to you today some of the ideas that we discussed and have a broader discussion about the connections among these three important questions in different locations in the world. So I'll say briefly a couple of words about the Social Science Research Council and the program I work for. So SSRC is an independent international nonprofit organization founded in 1923. It fosters innovative research, nurtures new generations of social scientists, deepens how inquiry is practiced within and across disciplines, and mobilizes necessary knowledge on important public issues. SSRC is guided by the belief that justice, prosperity, and democracy require better understanding of complex social, cultural, economic, and political processes. So SSRC has served as a central institution in the social study of religion for nearly 20 years. Its Religion in the Public Sphere program seeks to foster engagement and cooperation among social scientists, practitioners, and community leaders working on religion, spirituality, and related topics, and to support new and innovative scholarship in this critical area of study, and to elevate the quality of both academic and public discussion. And so I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this webinar again, and I'd like to thank the Berkeley Center for co-sponsoring it with us, and I'd like to thank the Luce Foundation for supporting this work. And at the moment, I would be happy to pass the mic metaphorically to Jocelyn Cesari, who is going to be moderating this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Molly. So I'm Jocelyn Cesari. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center, and I had the pleasure to initiate the first discussion we had in a closed workshop, and we wanted to offer a more public presentation and start a debate on this question of religion, gender, and populism. So our aim today is not only to share individual case studies, but also to frame collective inquiry, one that seeks to understand how populist movement strategically mobilize religious and gender narrative to construct political identities, enforce moral hierarchies, and consolidate authority. Across our previous discussion, we have seen that religion and gender are not static categories, but dynamic, mutually constitutive forces. Populist actors frequently invoke religious tradition to naturalize gender role and simultaneously instrumentalize gendered tropes to sacralize political projects. So whether through images of idealized motherhood in right-wing populism or portrayals of women as moral gatekeepers or cooptation of feminist language in populist feminism, gender and religion operate together as tools for cultural and political strategy. So we have discussed this dynamic across different geographies, from the role of religious women in shaping Latin American populist discourse to the gendered populism of the Middle Eastern authoritarian regime, and to the rise of Hindu nationalist symbols in India and evangelical narratives in the US. So also it is clear that we don't want to limit the role of religion to only right-wing populism. What we have seen is that populism is a very helpful asset for political movement across the ideological spectrum. And despite these ideological differences, we see shared patterns when it comes to women, and especially gendered and sexualized narratives to define who belongs. And the discourse on women have become a parameter to understand the national identity. So we will now continue this conversation in a more open way, and the format today will be really intentionally dialogic and open-ended. So we will begin with insights from our panelists from their different fieldwork that span, as you will hear, a range of religious and political context, and move then into a broader comparative reflection. So I would like to introduce the panelists. Before starting with them with a question to present their case studies. So the first panelist is by alphabetical order, not by order of appearance, so to speak, although it follows the program you have seen on the Berkeley Center website. Ruth Bronstein, who is professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut, Elzbieta Koralsuk, who is also a sociologist at the University of Södertörn in Helsinki, Didem Unal, no, sorry, Didem Ulan is in Helsinki. Sorry, I changed the belonging or membership here. Sorry about that. Tatiana Vargas Maya is a professor of international relations at the Rio Grande do Sul, the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. So without further ado, I'm going to open the presentation of the panelists with the following guiding questions. How are gender roles constructed or instrumentalized in the populist movement you examine? And to what extent do these movements rely on gendered metaphors, hierarchies, or moral orders to mobilize support? So each of you will have 7 minutes. So I give the floor first to Tatiana Vargas Maya. Tatiana, the floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Thank you so much for your question, Jocelyn. Good morning, everybody. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Social Science Research Council and the Berkeley Center for hosting this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here. Well, my recent work focuses on the Brazilian radical right, and more specifically on the political and symbolic role that Damares Alves plays within this group. Damares served as Minister of Women, Family and Human Rights under President Jair Bolsonaro, and she represents a particularly rich case for thinking about how gender roles are both constructed and instrumentalized within contemporary populist movements. Now, in the Brazilian context, gender plays a foundational role in the moral order that the radical right seeks to defend and to restore. The family, that is imagined as being nuclear, heterosexual, and especially Christian, is framed as the bedrock of our society. It is seen not just as a private unity, but as a sacred institution that anchors national identity and collective morality. Within this vision, gender roles are clearly delineated. Women are the primarily caretakers and mothers, while men are providers and protectors. Of course, none of this is new for the populist and far-right literature on gender. However, what I find very interesting about Damares Alves is that she complicates a bit this picture. She certainly upholds and promotes this traditional family model, but she also broadens the scope of how women can participate within this framework and within politics in Brazil. In her public discourse, Damares often celebrates motherhood as the highest and most noble role a woman can fulfill, but she also acknowledges different expressions of this role that deviate from the traditional family model. She talks frequently about adoption, for instance, and she emphasizes that even single, career-oriented women can live out a sacred maternal calling by choosing to adopt and raise children within Christian values, even if outside the traditional cut of the desired family model. This framing draws heavily on her own biography. Damares became a mother later in life through the extralegal adoption of an indigenous child, a process that has been widely contested, and with critics even accusing her of essentially kidnapping the kid. But regardless of this controversy, what is important here is how she weaves this story into her public persona and her political acts. She presents herself as a woman who overcame sexual abuse, personal trauma, poverty, and marginalization through faith, resilience, and especially divine calling. And this personal narrative becomes a powerful political tool, mostly because it resonates deeply with large segments of Brazilians, evangelical and working class population, many of whom see their own struggle reflected in her story. So, in terms of the construction of gender roles, I would say that we see a strategic combination here with Damares of both continuity of the traditional patterns we observe in populistic and radical right movements, but also and especially of adaptability. Her overarching narrative still positions women as nurturers and guardians of morality, but Damares seems to create space for women who don't entirely conform to that traditional mold, as long as they uphold the movement's broader moral and religious framework. In this sense, she offers a kind of acceptable deviation from the norm. Independent, outspoken, and politically active women are welcome within the movement, as long as they defend the sanctity of the family and reject both feminist and progressive agendas. Now, to the second part of your question on thinking how these movements rely on metaphors, hierarchies, and moral orders that are gendered to mobilize support. I think that here again, Damares plays a central role for the Brazilian populist movement. She doesn't just speak politically, she mostly speaks prophetically. She frames her role as part of a divine mission to rescue Brazil from a moral and spiritual decline. And this mission is framed in explicit opposition to feminist and queer rights, which she portrays not only as threat to the natural order of things, but also as a result of societal decay. I like to think that Damares, in a sense, is performing a sacralization of gender roles. In her narrative, gender becomes a theological category. It's rooted not only in tradition, but also in divine will. And the sacralization seems very effective to supporting and mobilizing her constituency, but also in justifying the broader performance of the radical right in Brazil. For instance, and I think this is a particularly interesting example, when questioned about Bolsonaro's erratic and often controversial, not to say grotesque behavior, she reframes his public persona through the lenses of religious redemption, but a specific way of being the redempted. She states that he is married to a truly evangelical woman, Michelle Bolsonaro, who sanctifies her husband, as the Bible teaches us. It's very appealing to emotion, to identity, and to faith, rather than just ideology. And I think this appeal helps explain why someone like Damares, a figure who doesn't fully conform to the stereotypical conservative housewife image, can be so effective within this space. Because she isn't just preaching doctrine, she's embodying a redemptive narrative. She becomes living proof that a woman can be powerful in public while still being morally aligned with traditional patriarchal values. And that's a very compelling message to a lot of people. So, to sum up, I would argue that in the case of the Brazilian radical right, gender roles are not only central to the movement, they are some of its most powerful tools for political mobilization. And Damares articulates these tools by weaving in her discourse and in her performance moral hierarchy, theological narratives, and highly emotional storytelling. She stands out as a figure who reinforces but also reconfigures these dynamics. She's a model of feminine power that operates within rather against the conservative order. It's a fascinating and complex form of ideological work that I think shows us how adaptable and potent gender and religion can be in populistic policies. Thank you so much, Jocelyn.
I think that I'm next up, if that's okay. So thanks so much for those remarks. And I'm I'm going to turn our attention to the United States, which is obviously a very complex political scene, where there's a lot of different things we could focus on. But the data point that I'm keeping my eye on most closely lately is uh, a survey question that is asked regularly by the by PRI, Public Religion Research Institute, and they ask whether people agree that society as a whole has become too soft and feminine. And overall, Americans have become less likely to agree with this question. It's actually declined about 5 percentage points from 2023. But at the same time, um, since PRI first started asking this question in 2011, the partisan divide around this question has more than doubled. And so in 2011, the partisan divide was around 23 percentage points, and today it is 57 percentage point partisan gap in terms of whether people believe that society has become too soft and feminized. Around 3/4 of Republicans believe that it has. Majorities of white Christian groups, including 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants, believe society has become too soft and feminized, and around 70% of Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers, in their terms, believe society has become too soft and feminized. So this has become a major point of contention and dividing line in American politics. And so how is it that this has become so central? And how is it that Americans, particularly those who fall into these subgroups that are most likely to agree, how is it that they've come to understand this and what to do about it? And, I think that one of the places that we can look for answers there has to do with theological ideas that are being developed in many Christian spaces. But also, it's really important that we look at more kind of influential right-wing and media figures who are talking about these issues. And in particular, I've spent a lot of time focused on figures like Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, before he left Fox News, hosted the highest rating primetime cable news show in history. He reached more than 4 million viewers each night at its peak. And it's really important to recognize the profound influence that Carlson and other figures like him have had on how Americans who tune into his programming understand this issue. He really, in the terms of people who've been following his work, discipled a generation of his viewers and sanctified a vision of social order that rests on a rigid hierarchy between social groups. And that hierarchy is racial, religious, gendered, and moral. In particular, in his different sort of ways of talking about this, he taught them to celebrate American democracy, but only when democratic institutions produce outcomes that affirm those hierarchies. And when they don't, when they produce outcomes that threaten those hierarchies, he encouraged his viewers to attack those institutions as illegitimate, as corrupt, really even as demonic, using those kinds of terms. And in as a replacement, to replace those institutions with a strong man dictator, like Donald Trump, whose role is to restore those hierarchies, whatever the cost to democracy. And so, just to give you an example of how all of these things come together in the kinds of messages that figures like Tucker Carlson promote, I want to talk about a speech that he gave in the run-up to the 2024 election. It was at a rally that was hosted by the organization Turning Point USA in Duluth, Georgia. And it was actually his first speech at a political rally. He typically was able to, broadcast his ideas to his audience. And so the speech was a bit of a kind of greatest hits tape of all of the themes that he likes to touch on in his work. It talked about invading foreigners and ideas associated with the Great Replacement theory. It talked about cities being destroyed. It celebrated Confederate generals as quote unquote our ancestors. It repeated assertions that Democrats are freaks and that Trump supporters should be proud of their politics and morality. But the center of the speech, really the emotional high point of the speech, was an extended metaphor that depicted Donald Trump as the country's angry father who comes home to find his disobedient teenage daughter running amok. And based on context, we are clearly supposed to understand that the disobedient teenage daughter represents liberals, or really anyone who doesn't support Trump, and maybe even this society as a whole, which has become too soft and feminine. And as Carlson explains, there has to be a point at which dad comes home. The angry father, we are told, loves his children and also loves justice. So he proceeds to give his misbehaving teenage daughter a, quote, vigorous spanking. He then proceeds to, in an extended manner, recite the phrase, "You've been a bad girl. You've been a bad little girl," while pretending to spank the teenage daughter. The crowd roared in appreciation, applause, and entertainment, and this really encourages Carlson. He continues, smiling. He says, "It's not going to hurt me more than it hurts you. No, it's not. I'm not going to lie. It's going to hurt you a lot more than it hurts me, and you deserved this. You're getting a vigorous spanking because you've been a bad girl." So, what is going on here? First of all, this is obviously just incredibly kind of strange behavior and incredibly misogynistic. And we know that Carlson has been accused of misogyny interpersonally, as has Donald Trump and many other figures in this movement. And misogyny is in many ways celebrated at the individual level, but it also operates importantly as a metaphor, and as a metaphor for how a strongman leader is supposed to be dominating the state apparatus and his subjects through fear, through violence, and through claims that this is really about love and justice. And to take pleasure in this exercise of strength and violence. So, I first heard this speech in the run up to the election, as did many of the supporters who were there. And so, what is clear is that what people in that audience were cheering for, right, is for this, right? This is the sort of product that they were buying when they voted for Donald Trump. That the vision that Tucker Carlson was promoting here was not one that was upsetting, but rather was quite appealing to many of the people in that audience. And I think that as we have watched Trump come to power and really relish seizing power in a way that reflects this kind of strongman impulse, it's important to recognize that this in part makes sense to many of his supporters, not only as a kind of political act, but also through this gendered lens of understanding that society and the democratic process is too feminine, and much like many of the policies that are intended to be kind of putting women back in their proper place in society, literally, so too does the strongman dictator put a feminized society back in its place. And so, I think that this has a lot to tell us about anti-democratic impulses within this movement and how it's wrapped up and really inseparable from this gendered metaphor. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. And now I pass the floor to Elzbieta. Elzbieta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation. And it's been a very interesting conversation, both during the workshop and now. And I'm Polish, and for the last 10 years, I've been studying Polish anti-gender mobilization and right-wing populism. But currently, I'm involved in a Kindle Horizon Europe project, in which I look at, with many other things from other countries. I'm particularly interested, and I'm studying Sweden. And it's quite interesting to look at those two countries in comparison, right? Because obviously they have very different histories, they have very different image. So Poland, for example, is seen as this kind of rather gender traditional country. And it is true that religion has become a key of national identity in Poland throughout 19th and also 20th century. So there is also this strong role of the Catholic Church, not only in terms of faith, but of a church as a political institution. The resulting situation is that in Poland we have the harshest anti-abortion law in Europe, except maybe from Malta, because since 2020 we have all abortions are illegal or banned except for the severe danger for women's health or life, or in the case of rape. So even in the case of severe malformation of the fetus, this is no longer legal. And of course, the populist parties have been behind this change. And the populist parties in Poland, such as Law and Justice, represent this very traditional, I would say, type of gendered nationalist position that Jocelyn was talking about, right? Imagining women as the bearers of national identity, those who are supposed to reproduce both culture and the nation itself. Within this context, the populist parties claim that gender equality, feminism, minority rights, LGBTQ rights are antithetical to national project, which is rooted in religion. And of course, in that sense, gender equality or gender studies are positioned, are portrayed as a form of foreign colonization, as a foreign intervention. So it is seen as an intervention from the West, who is corrupting us, allegedly, through gender equality ideas. And at the same time, intervention from the East, meaning the post-communist, the remnants of the communist times, right? Where, for example, abortion was legal in Poland. The Swedish context seemed to be so much different, right? So in the Swedish context, the nationhood is being structured around secular and gender equal vision of Sweden as the leader in the world when it comes to gender equality, for example, or minority rights, especially LGBTQ minority. So at the same time, Sweden is being reimagined by right-wing populist parties such as Sweden Democrats as a essentially white Christian nation, especially vis-a-vis immigrants, especially obviously the Muslim immigrants, who are seen as an outside threat, a threat not only to, for example, the welfare state system, but also a threat to a Swedish secularism and gender equality regime. So in that sense, in Sweden, for example, gender studies are also being attacked by populists, but in that case, they're being attacked as something that is akin to religion, right? So it is not rational, it is not scientific enough. It is seen as a form of ideology. So that's why it should be not included or not valued in secularized democratic Sweden. So in that sense, women are markers of Swedish nationality or national identity, but of course they are markers of Sweden's identity as a secularist, gender equal and white state. So if we take those two examples together, we see how in different contexts, depending on what type of visions of national identity are in circulation in a specific country, the ways in which gender roles, gender equality, minority rights are being structured and how they are talked about by populist forces are different. But at the same time, actually, there are quite a few similarities because in both countries, it is remarkably visible that we can see how much women become the bearers of national identity, the markers of national identity on the one hand, and how much this vision of Christianity and whiteness is being included or embedded as core for national identity in both cases. So in a sense, we can say that populists make use of gender and religion, of this intersection of gender and religion, in an opportunistic way, reflecting what type of arguments, what type of narratives can be accepted within the specific context. But at the same time, they tend to be quite, I would say, traditional in a sense of being embedded in gendered nationalism, as discussed by Yuval Davis, for example, right? Scholars who have seen that in many countries around the world, women are seen as not so much as citizens, as those who have agency, as those who are equal partners of a democratic process, but those who are to fulfill a specific role vis-a-vis the nation, who are supposed to reflect, to embed specific types of imaginaries about the nation and religion, and how much, well, how, to what extent, and it is a large extent usually, this actually undermines women's position as equals within the democratic process and within the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elzbieta. Didem, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you to the organizers and all the panelists for their insightful contributions. I would like to turn your attention to the Turkish case now. I will start by contextualizing this case first. Over the past decade, Turkey has undergone a profound democratic decline. This process has been marked by the concentration of executive power, increasing control over the media, and the systematic repression of civil society. These developments have placed Turkey firmly within the category of competitive authoritarian regimes, where elections continue to exist, but political competition is severely undermined. Today, the regime appears to be accelerating its transition into full autocracy, as seen in the arbitrary detention of opposition figures. This authoritarian transformation is animated by a populist logic that constructs politics through a moral binary between the pure people and the corrupt elites. It positions the ruling bloc as the sole authentic voice of the national will and delegitimizes dissenting voices. Justifying repressive policies through emotionally charged appeals to national, religious, and moral values, populism in this context functions as a key mechanism for legitimizing authoritarianism. Within this political logic, gender and sexuality have become central sites through which the regime consolidates power. Populist authoritarian actors in Turkey routinely frame gender ideology. That is a pejorative term they use to refer to gender equality and LGBTI rights as a foreign and corrosive force that threatens the moral foundations of the nation. Portraying gender ideology as an existential threat linked to Western imperialism, the regime casts itself as the guardian of the heterosexual family and Islamic values. By invoking emotionally charged narratives such as protecting children and saving the heterosexual family, populist authoritarian actors construct a political frontier between the people and their so-called enemies, that is, feminists, secular liberals, and LGBTI communities. This frontier logic enables the regime to manufacture consent for repressive measures by framing them as morally necessary acts of national self-defense. In this sense, gender in this project, in this Turkish case, is not a peripheral concern. It is strategically central to the moral grammar of authoritarian governance. This gendered moral order has been institutionalized through dramatic policy reversals. The withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, that is Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women, increasing censorship of LGBTI expression, and the replacement of rights-based gender frameworks with family-oriented agendas signal a systematic reshaping of the gender regime. It is important to emphasize that Turkey's anti-gender politics is not an isolated or uniquely domestic development. Over the past decade, rising opposition to gender equality and LGBTI rights around the world has increasingly been understood under the umbrella of the anti-gender movement. While locally adapted, these movements share a common ideological core: the rejection of gender ideology, the mobilization of politics through appeals to tradition and religion, and the depiction of gender equality as a foreign imposition. The term anti-gender captures a broad coalition of actors, including authoritarian regimes, far-right populists, religious conservatives, and even some centrist political forces. In Turkey, global anti-gender discourse is vernacularized through Islamist nationalist narratives that cast gender equality and LGBTI rights as threats not only to the heterosexual family, but also to Islamic faith. Islam is simultaneously mobilized as a symbol of grievance and as a marker of moral superiority. Populist actors frame Muslims as double victims, oppressed by Islamophobia abroad and corrupted by Western ideologies at home. Within this logic, Islamic tradition becomes both a vulnerable heritage to be defended and at the same time a superior civilizational model to be reasserted against the West's perceived moral decay. In Turkey, while ultra-secular nationalist actors are also part of the anti-gender field, it is Islamist actors who have driven this project, that is the anti-gender project, forward as its primary engine. Through religious foundations, state-aligned NGOs, they have played a leading role in establishing a hegemonic anti-gender power bloc. The Turkish state plays a central role in advancing this agenda, but it does so in close symbiosis with these societal actors. Top-down interventions, such as withdrawing from international agreements, are reinforced also from below by Islamist meso-level actors. This fusion of state power and societal mobilization has enabled the anti-gender project to penetrate deeply into Turkey's social fabric. Taken together, these developments reveal how gender, together with religion, has become a strategic axis through which the authoritarian regime in Turkey justifies repression and cultivates consent. This anti-gender politics is not merely a reactionary moral project, it is a means of authoritarian governance, a logic of societal control, and a powerful tool for constructing an exclusionary vision of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Didem. Thank you all. Now I'd like to ask to all of you a question to start the discussion. We have already seen, and Elzbieta has mentioned it already, some differences and also convergences. So the pattern is indeed a gendered discourse and a sexualized discourse that can take different shapes and content. And I would like to ask you if in the work you are doing, you can pinpoint historical legacies such as colonialism or the role of religion in the building of the nation that are invested now differently or slightly in another direction by these populist leaders. And also the role of women in politics in the different countries you are looking at, because the figure that Tatiana described is quite striking. It seems from we are hearing here and what we discussed before that anti-gender populism is not only a man issue. I'm provoking a little here, but so, and it came in your presentation. So this would be my question. You feel free to take any position on that, and it's a free. I'm not going to give you the floor, but yes, Elzbieta, please.
Thank you very much. I think this issue of whether populist projects or anti-gender projects are men's projects is very important, because to some extent there has been a period in the debate and also research on right-wing parties, especially fringe or extreme right-wing parties, which were called, when they were called men's parties, because there has been this disproportionate interest of men in voting for them and being engaged. But recent research shows that there is a change, and we observe it in Poland, but also we observe it in some other countries, that there is interest of women in those parties, we see that there are, of course, as Tatiana has said, there are many leaders who are female and who sort of navigate this space very eloquently. I have seen the current Prime Minister of Italy, when she was not yet the Prime Minister, at the World Congress of Feminists gathering, the gathering of anti-gender groups from all over the world. And she was very, I would say, great speaker, but she was sort of trying to weave this connection between sort of presenting herself as a traditional woman who has a child, who is doing womanly things, like, I don't know, ironing, but at the same time claiming that her motherhood position gives her a specific type of selfless interest in doing politics and being a politician. And I think that this is very important to observe, that many women are becoming leaders, that many women are attracted to this vision, which is partly, I would say, the result of many women being kind of crushing under the weight of a double burden of working and also having to have a family and taking care of it. So in that sense, these processes are not necessarily processes which affect only women or men, but these are across generation and across genders. And this is something that we should have really understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Elzbieta. Tatiana, you want to follow up on that?
Yes, thank you, Jocelyn. I would like to follow up on Elzbieta's point by saying and highlighting particularly the role of women in this populist and radical right movements. While I was preparing for our webinar today, I kept being reminded of Cynthia Zenlow in the Curious Feminist book, emphasizing that we should look at women and ask where are the women in the movements and phenomena that we study. And I think this is particularly relevant for the topic at hand for us. Looking at the women on contemporary populist movements, I think reveal a lot on how these movements are organizing. And I talked a lot about the figure of Damares in Brazil, but I do think that we can look at the broader connections and think that the context is highly relevant here. Damares is special in the Brazilian context because we see a political arena that is not very much feminized. Quite on the opposite, political participation of women in Brazil is very low, to the point that in 1995, the country had to establish quotas for the election of women, and these quotas haven't been working a lot. So to see Damares rising as a central figure in our contemporary politics, it's really interesting, but also to see that it's not isolated. One of the main conservatives, I would even say reactionary parties in Brazil nowadays, is called the Brazilian Women's Party. And it's profoundly misogynistic and conservative in their propositions. So there is this interesting contrast between the way how we think about political participation of women traditionally and how radical rights leaders, female leaders, are appropriating and resignifying it. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask another question, because we had this discussion in our previous work about a sort of ambiguity on the status of women, and that was particularly strong in the case of the US, where it's not only about motherhood and pious or virtuous figure. There is also a sexual dimension to it, and that's what Ruth was saying, and that doesn't fit really the speech you are talking about, doesn't really fit into a moral, virtuous kind of understanding of women. It was a play role that we can call it whatever we want, but that's certainly not a traditional Christian understanding of women's rights. So I see it in America. I see it in other contexts. There is this push towards sexualization also. It's not only motherhood, it's also sexual position of women in the nation. So could you say a few things on that, Ruth, and maybe others around?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super striking that appeals to reasserting a more traditional family structure go hand in hand with the hypersexualization of women. And in some ways, they both are part of a bigger project to put women back in their place, in their kind of proper place. One of those is more respectful, and one of those is more punitive. But the sort of ever-present threat of sexual violence as a method of punishing women who step out of line or assert personhood and independence from men is sort of a constant specter of much of this discourse that does feel contradictory. At the same time, the sort of power of these ideas has really rested on the acceptance of them by women. And in the U.S. context, as in these other settings, when we look at the kind of divide on many of these questions, it's not a gender divide as much as it is a divide on gender ideology. Is essentially, are women, promoting the equality of women in society and family life, or are they embracing an anti-feminist perspective that would prefer a hegemonic masculinity? And many women are ascribing to that, and that's in part due to influences within faith communities that promote a kind of theological vision that's really involved the erasure of women's historical roles in leadership in faith communities, and a kind of framing of theology that would present women as subservient to male authority. But it's also coming out of pop culture, and I think we shouldn't dismiss things like trad wife culture and the ways that anti-feminist ideas are being presented as really beautiful ways of life for women who are struggling to kind of maintain their sanity and personhood amidst the complicated demands of kind of modern capitalist parenting and life. So, those I think are worth taking seriously as well.
Yes, thank you. We have a question that goes actually in the sense of the current discussion, and I want to read it. Do we see this question that, Ruth, you mentioned about America becoming too soft or feminine being asked in other national context? If so, should we understand this as a transnational phenomenon? So the question is open to all of you. My understanding from, not from any of the context you are talking about, but from Islamist discussion, and maybe Didem can pull in that, there is indeed a reaffirmation not only of traditional women's role, but also men. And I wanted to ask you, Didem, how does this work in the Turkish context?
That's right, Jocelyn. Thank you so much for this question. Yes, you're right. Indeed, Islam is very central to the gendered populist project in Turkey, and it plays a huge role for a number of reasons. First and foremost, these populist actors rely on the Islamic tradition to define ideal roles for men and women, and there is a particular religious notion called fıtrat in Turkish, which is quite central to their project. This particular notion means divinely ordained human nature in men and women, and it specifically refers to gender complementarity between men and women. And according to the religio-conservative understandings of this notion, women's roles, social roles, should be geared towards more nurturing activities, and their roles are primarily defined within the familial sphere, whereas men are expected to be active in the public sphere. So this particular religious notion helps immensely. It's very instrumental for these actors to anchor and reinforce traditional gender roles in Turkish society. And so family, the idea of heterosexual family is also reinforced and mainstreamed according with references to the Islamic tradition. Protecting the heterosexual family is defined not only as a political urgency, but also as a religious duty. So this constant reference to the Islamic tradition and its and its religious norms, moral norms regarding masculinities, femininities, and in relation to protection of the heterosexual family is at the very center of gendered populism in Turkey.
Thank you. We have another question, and I think all of you can talk about this because all the cases can fall on one side or the other. The question is about evangelical political leaders. Do they really believe these ideas, traditional gender roles, opposition to LGBTQ rights, etc., or is it simply a tool for power? And the question is expanded to ask, how do you weigh this element in the research you do? Do you see these movements as driven by true believers, or are they just instruments? And yes, Elvira.
Well, I think that we have to differentiate between at least three levels, I would say. One level are the people who are following those movements, especially religious people. And I'm myself coming from a very religious Catholic family from rural Poland. And I have no doubts that my family is very sort of invested in a specific type of views on abortion, for example, as a sin. So this is a very, I would say, invested ways in which religion is very much embedded in your everyday life and life work and life view. The second level is our organizations, such as the DEM has explained. The anti-gender movement has many civil society organizations. Many of them are international. Many of them has the specific contact with religious institutions, some with governments. And they, I would say, are much more opportunistic because it's about resources, it's about influence, it's about power. And then, of course, we have the level of right-wing populist parties who, in my view and in my research, tend to be the most opportunistic because we have leaders who have, I guess, a chance to actually better the conditions for example, bearing and rearing children in a specific country. So to make it easier for families, for people who actually have children, but instead they would focus on controlling women's bodies, on controlling people's individual choices. So in that sense, they're really, we can see a specific moment, for example, around 10 years ago, where a lot of right-wing populist parties started to adopt the language of gender as danger, right? So not because they have changed their views, but because they saw an opportunity to actually sow fear, basically, because fear is a very powerful political emotion. And it creates a mobilization among parents, for example, who wants to protect their children from sexualizations, right? So it's very easy then to mobilize people who are not politicized otherwise.
Yes, any other take on this question? Because it seems to me that it does, you're absolutely right to distinguish these three levels. If we add more, even the personal leadership, because that's a question that has come a lot, people indeed would sense that this is instrumentalization, but it doesn't matter because religious people invest in this leader. I think that's the American case particularly. It doesn't matter that the person is not a believer or good member of a church or congregation, is still seen as a divine tool to reach a goal. So that's very important what you just differentiate in terms of level of where does belief play a role. But I also like to say that in some cases, the leader is a pious man. Erdogan is a pious man, no? And it also contributes to his authenticity, I think, no?
Yeah, maybe if I may, I can add a few small points on this. I think when we think about the role of religion in gendered populism, we really need to distinguish between between understandings of religion as an instrument, as a mere instrument, and as a meaning making. So both roles can be detected in these gender populist in gender populist projects. So when religion, in the Turkish case, when Islam is evoked in the ruling party's discourses, it is sometimes defined as a marker of national identity, as the as in more symbolic terms, but at other times it also features as a matter of faith. So both portrayals are part of this religio-conservative project, and suggesting that Islam only or religion in general plays only an instrumental role would be a reductionist narrative, in my opinion. So we need to take into account the various ways within which religion appears in these projects.
Yes, thank you. I think we are reaching the time of closing up. We have one question that I give you, but it opens up a whole new path, which is, can modern science be a counterpoint to misogynistic religious belief and practice? From what I hear now, I think in some way you have, in a indirect way, responded to the question, in the sense that religion has a role beyond science, and it's about collective meaning. It's about investment in a community. It's about this emotional load, that goes with who you are as a person, who you are as a citizen, and it cannot just be fought by rationality or cognitive approach, and that's an important point to keep in mind. Yes, Ruth, I give you 1 minute. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would just add to that I think that it's not surprising that, at least in the US context, but also around the world, that science is being politicized by many of these movements, and that when scientific findings are inconvenient for the kind of vision of society that they're promoting, there's a tendency to frame science and other kinds of institutions as driven by, quote unquote, gendered ideology or kind of leftist ideology. And so that's not true of all science, right? It's usually just true of the scientific findings that are challenging to this particular worldview. And so I think that we should be kind of clear about that process as well.
Yeah, thank you for adding this point. That's important. So we have 1 minute to close. First, let me thank our audience for following for an hour this discussion, and thank you to the colleagues here, all of you. It has been really my pleasure, honor to be part of this discussion over the few past months. And thank you, SSRC and the Berkeley Center, for organizing, monitoring, and guiding us up to this day. So thank you all, and maybe we have another occasion to talk about that. We'll see in the next step of this reflection. Thank you very much.